President Trump's emergency management officials are discussing reforms that would make it much harder for communities to qualify for federal disaster assistance. This honors the president's executive order to shift more responsibility for disaster response and recovery to states rather than the federal government. This comes as places like northern Michigan and Arkansas are fighting to get aid after severe weather devastated communities in both of those states. Joining us tonight is Mark Neveau, a former FEMA presidential appointee. Mark actually coordinated efforts here in Michigan after flooding in 2013 under then President Barack Obama. Thanks for joining us, Mark. We appreciate it.
You're welcome, Ty.
Good to have you. First off, break this down for us. It's pretty complicated. How would these changes affect how FEMA operates and how states like Michigan get help from the agency?
Yeah, it is a complicated situation, but what the president wants to do is try and streamline how money is allocated to states for recovery. Now, we got to break it down into two segments, one being response. So when FEMA comes into play in a disaster, they bring in urban search and rescue teams, disaster medical assistance teams, disaster mortuary teams, urban search and rescue, water rescue, etc. And so that's one component. They're talking about moving that under the National Security Council at the White House, but they're also talking about revamping the grant programs for recovery.
Okay, so what stage are we at? Are these changes already in motion or just FEMA talking with the White House and the Trump administration at this point?
Yeah, I wish it was just discussion, but they're moving down the path pretty quickly. And I think the changes can be beneficial. It's dependent upon how they do that, right? The proof is in the pudding. And so as they move through here, what they're talking about is having each state have to qualify to meet a standard to be able to get federal assistance. That meaning, for instance, in 2023, Michigan had flooding for 9 counties, and the federal government provided $103 million for people to be able to find, rental assistance, to rebuild their homes, child care, things of that nature. So the question will be, does Michigan have the capability to handle that on their own, or do they need the federal government's involvement?
Well, and speaking of that, critics say this plan shifts too much responsibility onto the states and those potentially struggling budgets in the future. What's your assessment of that?
Well, it depends upon which state you come from. If you look at California, for instance, they're the 4th largest economy in the world. So they have a tremendous amount of resources available. Conversely, you look at some of the smaller states, South Dakota, that have a population of 1 million. So it depends upon which state and what capabilities they already have existing. But what we do know is they've got to be very careful about how they do this, because Mother Nature is going to continue to provide storm damage, as we've heard from Ron just a few moments ago. And so the potential is, if you move too quick and you don't have resources available to help people when they need it, then the improvements certainly aren't going to be advantageous.
Right. We know these storms and these disasters aren't going to stop anytime soon. So what happens if a state doesn't have the disaster response funding to deal with these kind of disasters? Are they just out of luck?
Well, that's the question mark for many states. And I think governors are already in the position that they're going to have to think about, when we put reserve budgets aside, we're going to have to increase that amount of money, not knowing how this is going to play out. But we do know that 22 states have already filed suit regarding federal funding and the withdrawal of that funding. Although it doesn't apply necessarily to disaster funding, there are implications about what authority the presidential administration has to be able to make changes. I think this can be a good thing if it's done the right way.
All right. Mark Neveau, former presidential appointee, a lot of moving parts here, a lot of things that could and might not happen. So thanks for helping us understand it to this point. We appreciate it.
You're welcome, Ty. Have a good evening.